Hi, I'm Lena. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today I want to do something fun. I want to recommend a book for every decade. I'm going to start this journey in the 19th century because I don't think I could recommend you a book that I actually also liked from the 17th and 18th century and earlier. We're going to start in the 19th century all the way through the 20th century. This video is going to be part 1 and today we're going to talk about the 19th century. I'm also going to do a little digital museum with you today because I picked some art pieces that I enjoy from every decade as well, because I'm just a little bit extra. So we're going to start in the first decade of the 1800s. I need to kind of slightly cheat because it turns out I have not read a single book between 1800 and 1809. So I'm going to show you a book that was written in that period but only published later, and that is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Of course, Jane Austen is the queen of early 19th century literature, and Northanger Abbey was the first novel that she wrote. She sent it for publication in 1802, but the publisher didn't publish it. She was a new author. The book would have been published under an anonymous name. The publisher also had some financial trouble and they just took forever to publish it. It was only published in 1818. Northanger Abbey is quite a unique book within the books of Jane Austen because it has a gothic vibe, for which we all know it very well, I think. In Northanger Abbey we follow a main character who goes to the seaside, and in this seaside she meets different people, and while she also reads Anne Radcliffe's novels, and in her wild imagination things from Anne Radcliffe's novels don't seem like such big fictional tales anymore, and she starts to think that they could actually happen within the things that she sees around her. Jane Austen always has amazing romances. The romance in this novel is definitely not my favorite. I love the drama and the mental exploration that our main character goes on. Not necessarily my favorite Jane Austen, but I don't have any Jane Austen that I don't like. Alright, we have arrived in the second decade, in the 1810s. Here I had way more choice because we have the beautiful decade of Jane Austen. And yes, I'm going to mention Jane Austen again, and I'm going to mention the novel that surprised me most, and that was Mansfield Park. This is a novel by Jane Austen that a lot of people say is their least favorite. I can see why, but I enjoyed this a lot. I gave it 5 stars. It is a bit of a different setting than our usual Jane Austen. I think it does not necessarily have the coziness where our main character is very free of problems and is not necessarily very lonely because she has so many lovely family around her. That is not the case for the main character of Mansfield Park. She's quite lonely. She lives with family who all somehow outrank her and treat her that way. She is the kind of character that has to make a living for herself. Fanny is shy. Fanny is an introvert, and she really needs a lot of time to admit her feelings to herself and to the people around her and to communicate what she actually wants. This is so interesting, and Fanny is put in the middle of so many different family relations, of so many different interests, and it's really hard for her to fight for her own interest, which is what she needs to do in order to survive. This again does not have my favorite romance, but I think it is a realistic one. We have arrived in the 1820s. For this I want to recommend an American short story called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. This is a Halloween legend. I had of course heard about the legend of the Headless Man and about all the references we see during Halloween, but the story itself is very fun to read. We follow a man called Ichabod Crane, and Ichabod Crane is very interested with his own desires and his love for food. He goes around people's houses making sure they like him and they give him food, but one day he encounters the legend of Sleepy Hollow or the legend of the Headless Man, and he gets really very scared. This was a fun short story to read. Would definitely recommend reading this during Halloween. Heading over to the 1830s, we're going from the US to Denmark, where a very famous man called Hans Christian Andersen wrote one of our most beloved fairy tales. My favorite fairy tale from Hans Christian Andersen is The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid was a very personal story for Hans Christian Andersen. The Disney version we know so well isn't very true to the story that Hans Christian Andersen wrote. He wrote about the Little Mermaid that feels very mythical. And yes, she wants legs. Yes, she wants to walk the earth, and she falls in love with a human man. But their love is impossible, and his story does not have a happy ending in a way that the Disney book does. The love that the Little Mermaid had for the human man is said to be reflected for the love that Hans Christian Andersen had for another man, and that other man married a woman. Knowing that, I could definitely see how incredibly tragic this story was. I think without that knowledge you would very soon classify this story as extremely sexist because of all the things that the Little Mermaid does just for a man. But what she does is not necessarily for the man, it is for her passions and emotions and wants and needs, which makes this a very interesting read. Okay, we have now arrived in the 1840s, which might be my favorite decade of Victorian literature, because we are back in England, we are in Haworth, we are with the Brontë sisters, who wrote amazing things in this decade. Earlier in this decade, they wrote their poetry, which they tried to publish but weren't very successful, and then they wrote their novels. And the first novel of the Brontë sisters that just blew up and everyone started to read was Jane Eyre. I would recommend actually all the Brontë novels, almost all the Brontë novels, but if you are new to the Brontë sisters, then start with Jane Eyre. This is such an amazing story of an orphaned girl who tries to find her place in a world until she works as a governess for Mr. Rochester, his ward. There is a lot you can say about the relationship between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, but this book is so amazing. It is so well written. It is so fun to read. This is a book you can read over and over again. As you can see, I was very happy to give this book a reread. I loved it a lot more on my reread than I did on my first read. If you don't know, I host together with Mary and Sarah the Brontëlong. We have almost finished now, and I personally have read all the Brontë novels. I wouldn't say Jane Eyre is my favorite, but Jane Eyre is the easiest to recommend because I can just see everyone loving this book. Right, we have arrived in the second half of the 18th century, which is the hardest for me to recommend because there are just so many books that I absolutely adore. So I'm going to pick a few books that I haven't overly recommended in other videos. You're going to not see a lot of my favorite books here. I have a lot of other recommendation videos. I will leave a link to the playlist of all my recommendation videos in the description down below. But for the 1850s, I'm going to recommend Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell is probably an author you have heard of if you have read some Victorian literature. She wrote a lot of very well beloved novels, but I always think that Cranford is kind of her forgotten baby because this is so witty, so funny. Any fan of Jane Austen I think will really enjoy Cranford. This book surrounds a village where a lot of elderly women live who really like their ways. This is a group of mainly very conservative ladies who do not like to do anything they're not used to. They really appreciate their habits, and it's so incredibly funny, especially when things in the town don't exactly go to plan. There's also a second storyline that I'm not going to say anything about, but that has a little bit more of an engaging plot and it's not just witty and funny. But I enjoyed this a lot. I read this in 2 days and I had such a good time with this. We're going to stay in England for a bit, and it is now the 1860s, and right at the beginning of this decade we meet George Eliot with The Mill on the Floss. George Eliot has written a lot of wonderful novels. I would not necessarily say this is my favorite, but I feel like I haven't talked to you about this novel quite enough. The Mill on the Floss follows Maggie Tulliver, who is a farmer's daughter, and she tries to educate herself, and she really does not like the difference between her and her brother and the way that they are raised when it comes to gender. Maggie is quite a figure, and I really enjoyed reading about her because she really knows her own mind. This book does have some slow parts. You feel like it could have been shorter, but because it's George Eliot's writing, it is gorgeous, it is beautiful. It is just an amazing reading experience. 1870s. Oh my, there were some amazing books written in this decade. But we are leaving England for a bit and we're going all the way to Russia, to a book that so many people dearly love and I really enjoyed as well. And that is Anna Karenina by Lev Tolstoy. This one was published a bit later in the decade. In 1877 it was published in the original Russian. Anna Karenina is such a vast big story where we follow different characters, but it's mainly set around the character of Anna Karenina and people that she knows, her family. We also follow Lenin, who is a landowner, and he is more of the intellectual philosophical part of this book that I did not really enjoy, but I really enjoyed all the other characters, especially the female characters and their relationship with their sense of self, their sense of passion and romance. I thought was incredibly well written in this book. Anna Karenina is a tragic book, but it has amazing characters and it's truly worth every page. We have arrived in the 1880s, and in this decade an amazing poet passes away, and that poet is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was an American poet. Her poetry was mainly published after her death, so that is why I am classifying her for the 1880s, although I think most of her poetry was written quite a bit earlier. I've read quite a bit of this collection. I really enjoy Emily Dickinson's poetry, some of which I could quite easily understand, some of which I couldn't. The poetry is quite dark. It is about love, but it's mainly about death and the meaning of life. Emily Dickinson is one of America's greatest and most original poets of all time. She took definition as her providence and challenged the existing definitions of poetry and poets' work. She experimented with expressions in order to free it from conventional restraints. She crafted a new type of persona for the first person. The speakers in Dickinson's poetry, like those in Brontë's and Browning's works, are sharp-sighted observers who see the inescapable limitations of their societies as well as their imagined and imaginable escapes. To make the abstract tangible, to define meaning without confining it to inhabit a house that never became a prison, Dickinson created in her writing a distinctively elliptical language for expressing what was possible but not yet realized. So we have arrived in the final decade of this century. In the 1890s we got The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is still a book that a lot of people enjoy. Oscar Wilde wrote multiple things, but this is his only novel. 1 year later, a revised version of this novel came out. I believe I have read the revised version and not the original, but I would definitely recommend you read the original, of course, which I will do if I ever reread this book. This is a story about a man who has a portrait taken, and instead of him aging, his portrait aged. And he's incredibly vain, he is very greedy, and eventually that of course blows up. I think that's all I want to say about the plot. This is a short book. It has beautiful writing. I think I didn't fully appreciate it on my first read, but this is definitely worth a read. So that is part 1 of book recommendations for every decade. Stay tuned later for this week for part 2. Doei!